Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. First, a word from the sponsor of the Compliance Podcast Network for this month, Ethico.
If you're a compliance officer, middle managers are crucial in getting your programs from you to your frontline employees. But how do we activate those managers and get them on our side? Ethico's new Middle Manager Toolkit equips you with the skills needed to empower your managers, to promote a culture where ethical behavior thrives and employees feel empowered to speak up. Learn how to turn frontline managers into ethical leaders with our new white paper, Empowering Middle Managers as Ethics Champions. And did I mention you can get the whole toolkit for free? Head to ethico.com to download the full toolkit today.
10 for 10 for the week ending February 22, 2025. Our first story is not compliance, but I couldn't pass it up, which is Kentucky Fried Chicken is leaving Kentucky. Yes, the corporate headquarters of Kentucky Fried Chicken is moving to the great state of Texas. So will you be able to get Kentucky Fried Chicken in Kentucky? I suspect so, but it shows that names really mean nothing as Kentucky Fried Chicken leaves Kentucky. Our next story is a little more fraud-oriented as Synapse executive alerted accountants before the $100 million missing funds scandal. A former executive testified before a New York grand jury who is probing fraud and potential other felonies. He raised alarms with the company before it collapsed. The company connected financial tech firms with banks, helping startups find a place to park their digital customers' funds. This middleman managed billions at its peak, but suddenly collapsed with people unable to access their money. A court-appointed mediator later disclosed as nearly $100 million managed by the company might be missing. So, scandals in the crosshairs of New York prosecutors. Of course, that's assuming Trump allows prosecution for fraud. Speaking of fraud, we have Patel, now the FBI director, who stands to make millions from the English company Shein going public. Why is this important? Well, Shein has huge Chinese backing, and it was founded in China, and now we have a critic of China in the Trump administration standing to make millions of dollars with China. If that's not a conflict of interest, I don't know what is. Next up, get your chiropractic appointment calendar ready. We've had another crazy ride on the Corporate Transparency Act. Yes, the CTA is back on. And we had two developments this week. Number one, the second judge in the Eastern District of Texas removed the nationwide injunction against enforcement of the CTA. Secondly, the FinCEN in the Department of Treasury extended the deadline for filing to March 21. So if you haven't filed your FinCEN, you better get going. Of course, it's believed the government will defend FinCEN and the Corporate Transparency Act. But once again, this is the Trump administration, and Trump has now said he will make the decision on every law interpreted in the United States. Because, of course, he's the president, and that's what he thinks presidents do. So it's going to be interesting to see if he is willing to fight money laundering. What do you think? Next up from CNN, one more story about how the Trump administration has gutted the federal government's ability to fight public corruption. The DOJ has paused all investigations into corporate foreign bribery, curtailed enforcement of foreign agent registration law, de-emphasize criminal prosecution of Russian oligarchs. Senior administration officials are considering eliminating the DOJ's public integrity section formally, although have done it informally by firing everyone. So, corruption will be unprosecuted in the Trump administration. What that means for compliance officers is your job will become even more important going forward. Next up, the UK bank Barclays, which we can only say has had lots of issues around ethics, compliance, corruption, money laundering, dodgy things in general, etc. over the years, is now under investigation yet again by the UK Financial Crimes Authority, or the Financial Conduct Authority. UK's main financial regulator. It's conducting a civil enforcement action investigating Barclays' controls. Barclays is said to be cooperating. The probe focuses on historical oversight and management of higher risk customers. The investigation touches on Barclays' UK bank, which handles retail banking for individuals. So Barclays under the watch again. And some good news from Yahoo Finance. Wells Fargo's 2018 consent order has been lifted and terminated by the comptroller of the currency. This was the 10th consent order of Wells Fargo, and this latest order was terminated after the bank paid the $500 million fine, but it also, the bank finally got its Compliance Act together, and that's the bigger story, at least for compliance professionals, from this story that Wells Fargo has not only committed to compliance, but actually executed on that. So kudos to Wells Fargo. Congrats for getting out under this consent decree. Next up, from the Wall Street Journal, there is a huge imbroglio brewing over Trump personally suing Paramount over a 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris. Trump claimed that it was edited. I am shocked to find that it was edited. Did you know that? A TV interview would be edited? How about a podcast interview? Well, Trump sued Paramount saying that the editing was fraudulent. And Paramount was apparently considering settling this lawsuit. But then the board of directors began to worry, would this subject them to allegations of bribery and corruption? Because Paramount's application to be sold is in front of the FCC right now. So Paramount has now changed course and is considering fighting this lawsuit and asking some very, very difficult questions of Donald Trump, who has sued them in his personal capacity, including judge shopping, because of course they didn't file this in New York, they filed their lawsuit in Texas. That's the great state of Texas, where judges are Trump friendly. Next up, from the FT, the trial of Charlie Javice, who was the owner of a company called Frank, is finally started. It is a very interesting case because her company, Frank, which put together students and families who were seeking money to go to college with colleges and their funding mechanisms, whether scholarship or other, has now claimed that these are trumped-up charges brought by J.P. Morgan. The defense team claims that it's actually J.P. Morgan who got the Southern District of New York to bring the criminal charges, not civil charges, and that she defrauded J.P. Morgan because they didn't do enough due diligence. Although we no longer have buyer beware, it's certainly important to do due diligence. Our final story comes to us from Bloomberg, and it really highlights what happens when tariffs blow up your business plan. I've talked about this and written about this. You need to be prepared for a wild ride.
For 10 is a special production of the award-winning Compliance Podcast Network. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, our network sponsor is Ethico, and they've got a great new service offering for you, a middle manager's toolkit. We've linked to it in the show notes, and it's available to you at no cost. Many companies struggle with getting information to middle managers, which allows them to be the first line of response in a speak-up culture. And Ethisphere has answered this challenge by putting together a middle manager's toolkit. Check it out in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. I hope you'll check out the newest podcast in the Compliance Podcast Network, the Compliance Tip of the Day. In Compliance Tip of the Day, I give a 5 to 8 minute summary of one tip that you can integrate into your compliance program or put together for greater compliance program efficiency.